Prepare to immerse yourself in an edge-of-your-seat thriller packed with twists, suspense, and unforgettable characters. This reimagined tale is adapted for an American audience, offering a spellbinding narrative that will leave you eager for more. The story unfolds in the quiet town of Clearwater Hills, nestled in the remote Appalachian Mountains. Set in the 1970s, this picturesque yet eerie town harbors a chilling secret. The tale begins with Randy Morrison, a local gambler known for frequenting a shady bar on the town's outskirts. One evening, after a losing streak at the bar's poker table, Randy is approached by Vernon Blake, a mysterious figure known for his bets and dares. Vernon offers Randy an unusual wager: light a lantern in the abandoned Starlight Temple, a place shunned by the townsfolk after sundown. In return, Randy would win Vernon's prized goat. Should Randy fail, he must pay a mere quarter. Despite the town's superstition that the temple is cursed, Randy, emboldened by alcohol, accepts the challenge. He gathers a few friends and heads to the temple. As the group ventures into the dark woods, laughter turns to trepidation. Upon reaching the temple and lighting the lantern, they are confronted by something so horrifying that they all collapse, unconscious. The story shifts to Whitewood Manor, where the reclusive town patriarch, Mr. Bradford, resides. 25 years prior, Bradford's son tragically died during a festival at the temple. Since that day, Bradford abandoned his ancestral home in town for the solitude of the manor. In the town, whispers of disappearances grow louder. The townsfolk approach Bradford, pleading for action as the missing persons count rises to 32. Despite their cries, Bradford remains stoic and retreats to his mansion. In a bustling city nearby, Ryan Carter, a recent college graduate with a knack for solving mysteries, is introduced. Ryan dreams of becoming a detective and often aids the local police in solving cases with his uncanny observational skills. One morning, Ryan's professor and mentor, Dr. Vincent Hale, receives a distressing letter from Clearwater Hills, his hometown. The letter details the mysterious disappearances and the growing unease in the town. Dr. Hale persuades Ryan to investigate, promising a handsome reward from Mr. Bradford. Initially hesitant due to his ailing mother, Ryan reluctantly agrees after her health deteriorates further, leaving him desperate for funds for her treatment. Ryan's arrival in Clearwater Hills marks the start of a series of inexplicable encounters. On his way to the manor, he meets Laura Blake, a philosophy student with a captivating charm. Offering him a ride, Laura introduces herself and speaks cryptically about the town's haunted past. Her words, coupled with the eerie silence of the town, deepen Ryan's resolve to uncover the truth. Upon meeting Bradford, Ryan finds the old man dismissive of the town's fears. But when a child pleads with Ryan to help her forgotten father, memories of his own absent father resurface. This emotional connection compels Ryan to dig deeper. In the shadow of the Starlight Temple, a tale of ancient curses, modern greed, and human resilience begins to unravel. As Ryan delves into the town's secrets, he learns that nothing is as it seems. Ryan left Bradford's manor with a mix of frustration and curiosity. The old man had barely acknowledged his questions, brushing him off with vague reassurances that the town's troubles were nothing but superstition. Yet Ryan couldn't shake the child's desperate words. "Help my father? He's forgotten me." Walking through the quiet streets of Clearwater Hills, Ryan felt the weight of the town's unease. Doors shut quickly as he passed, and curtains shifted as unseen eyes followed his every move. At the small diner near the center of town, he decided to stop and gather information. The place smelled faintly of grease and coffee, its atmosphere thick with whispered conversations. A middle-aged waitress, her name tag reading Evelyn, approached him cautiously. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him and hesitated before speaking. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes darted to the other patrons, as if wary of being overheard. Ryan smiled politely. "Just visiting. I heard there's been trouble in town. Missing people." He kept his tone casual, hoping to draw her out. Evelyn leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You shouldn't be asking about that. Folks don't like to talk about it, especially not strangers." She glanced toward the back of the diner, where an older man with a grizzled beard sat silently, his gaze fixed on Ryan. Ryan persisted. "I'm here to help. Someone needs to figure out what's going on before more people disappear." Evelyn's expression shifted to one of wary sympathy. If you really want to know, you should talk to the sheriff. But don't expect much. Sheriff Collins hasn't been the same since his deputy vanished 2 months ago. The door to the diner creaked open, and a tall man in a worn uniform stepped inside. His face was gaunt, and his eyes were sunken, shadowed with fatigue. Ryan guessed immediately that this was Sheriff Collins. Evelyn stiffened and retreated behind the counter, leaving Ryan to approach the man. "Sheriff Collins," Ryan began, extending a hand. "I'm Ryan Carter. Dr. Hale sent me." The sheriff's gaze was sharp but hollow as he shook Ryan's hand. "Dr. Hale? Vincent Hale?" Ryan nodded. "He told me about the situation here. I want to help." Collins sighed heavily and gestured for Ryan to sit at a booth. "You're wasting your time, kid. This town's problems can't be solved with logic or reason. Whatever's happening, it's beyond that." Ryan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Then tell me what you think it is." The sheriff hesitated, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, he spoke. "It started at the temple. That place has been cursed ever since the accident 25 years ago. Anyone who goes near it, they don't come back the same." Ryan listened intently, piecing together the fragments of information. "But why? What's at the temple?" Collins's eyes darkened. "I don't know, and I'm not about to find out. If you're smart, you'll stay far away from it too." Undeterred, Ryan pressed on. "Who's the last person who went missing?" The sheriff rubbed his temples. "A teacher, Mr. Williams. He went to the temple with a group of kids for a field trip. Only the kids came back. None of them could explain what happened." Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. "Can I talk to the kids?" Collins shook his head. "They've been sent away. Their families moved out of town right after. Said they couldn't handle staying here anymore." As the sheriff spoke, Ryan noticed Laura Blake outside the diner, standing by her car. She seemed to be watching him, her expression unreadable. When their eyes met, she gestured for him to follow her. Excusing himself, Ryan left the diner and approached Laura. "You seem to show up at just the right time," he said, like attempting to mask his suspicion. Laura smiled faintly. "And you seem to be sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Ryan crossed his arms. "Maybe, but I'm not stopping. What do you know about the temple?" Laura hesitated, then opened her car door. "Get in. There's something you need to see." Against his better judgment, Ryan climbed into the passenger seat. As Laura drove toward the edge of town, the streets grew narrower and the air heavier, laden with an unexplainable tension. They stopped at an overgrown path leading into the woods. Laura killed the engine and turned to Ryan. "This is as far as I go. If you want answers, you'll have to find them yourself." Ryan frowned. "What's out there?" Laura didn't answer. She simply nodded toward the path and handed him a flashlight. Ryan stepped out of the car, the flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. As he ventured into the woods, a sense of unease settled over him. The towering trees seemed to close in, and every rustle of leaves made his heart race.
Watching them.
Then he saw it. The silhouette of the temple, shrouded in mist, its looming presence both majestic and foreboding. Ryan took a deep breath and stepped closer, unaware that unseen eyes were watching his every move. Ryan stood at the edge of the Starlight Temple, its ancient structure partially obscured by vines and fog. The air felt thick, almost alive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The temple's entrance was marked by crumbling stone pillars carved with symbols he couldn't decipher. His flashlight flickered, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on his mind. As he approached the heavy wooden doors, he noticed they were slightly ajar. Pushing them open with a creak, Ryan stepped inside. The interior was cold and damp, with the faint scent of decay hanging in the air. The walls were covered in faded murals depicting scenes of celebration and sacrifice, their meanings lost to time. At the center of the room stood an altar, its surface blackened and cracked as if it had been struck by lightning. Ryan's eyes were drawn to a cluster of candles at the far end of the room. They were unlit, but their placement seemed deliberate, forming a pattern he couldn't immediately recognize. As he crouched to examine them, he heard a faint sound behind him, a soft shuffle, almost imperceptible. Spinning around, he raised his flashlight, its beam sweeping across the room. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. For a moment, there was silence. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, A man, disheveled and gaunt, his clothes torn and his eyes wild with fear. He looked like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. The man stumbled forward, muttering incoherently, his hands trembling as he clutched a scrap of cloth. Ryan stepped back cautiously. "Are you okay? Who are you?" The man's gaze snapped to Ryan, his expression shifting from confusion to desperation. You shouldn't be here," he stammered. "It'll find you, like it found me." "What are you talking about?" Ryan pressed. "What will find me?" The man shook his head violently, his movements erratic. "The mist, the shadows, it takes your mind, makes you forget who you are. I tried to leave, but it's always watching." Before Ryan could ask more, the man shoved the scrap of cloth into his hands. It was an old, tattered map, marked with symbols and a single word scrawled in the corner: Ascension. Without another word, the man bolted toward the temple doors, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. Ryan hesitated, the map clutched tightly in his hand. Something about the man's panic felt genuine, but he couldn't ignore the sense of foreboding that lingered. He scanned the map under the flashlight's beam. It appeared to show a series of tunnels beneath the temple, with paths leading deep into the forest. One particular spot was circled, accompanied by a symbol he didn't recognize. The sound of footsteps pulled his attention back to the doorway. This time, it wasn't the man returning. It was Laura. She stood in the entrance, her face illuminated by the dim moonlight. "You came inside," she said, her voice low and calm. "That wasn't smart." Ryan straightened, holding up the map. "What is this place, Laura? What's really going on here?" She glanced at the map, then back at him, her expression unreadable. "You should leave. This town has a way of swallowing people whole. If you go any further, you might not come back." "Not an option," Ryan said firmly. "I need answers." Laura stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you're set on staying, then you'll need help. The map, it shows where it all started, but getting there won't be easy." Ryan met her gaze, sensing a flicker of sincerity behind her guarded demeanor. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I've lost enough people to this place," she replied, "and I'm tired of watching it happen." The two left the temple together, retracing Ryan's steps through the darkened forest. The map felt like a key to unraveling the mystery, but Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that it was also a warning. As they reached the car, Laura hesitated before speaking. "There's someone you need to meet. Someone who knows more about the temple and the disappearances than anyone else." "Who?" Ryan asked, intrigued. "Father James," she said. "He used to run the church in town before everything fell apart, but you'll have to convince him to talk. He doesn't trust outsiders." Ryan nodded, determined. "Then I'll make him trust me." Laura gave him a long, searching look. "Be careful, Ryan. The deeper you dig, the more dangerous this gets. Not everyone in this town wants the truth to come out." Her words lingered in his mind as they drove back toward town. The temple's secrets were just beginning to unfold, and Ryan knew he was stepping into a darkness far greater than he'd imagined. The drive back to town was silent, the tension between Ryan and Laura palpable. The weight of the map in his pocket felt heavier with each passing mile. When they reached the outskirts of Clearwater Hills, Laura pulled up in front of a weathered old chapel. Its steeple was crooked, and the wooden boards covering its windows hinted at years of neglect. "This is where you'll find Father James," Laura said, cutting the engine. "He hasn't held a service in years, but he still lives here. Be patient with him. He's different now." Ryan opened the car door but paused before stepping out. "You're not coming with me?" Laura shook her head. "He wouldn't talk to me even if I tried. He doesn't trust anyone who's been here too long." Ryan hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see what I can find out." As Laura drove off, Ryan turned toward the chapel. The moonlight cast long shadows across its crumbling facade, making it appear more sinister than sacred. He pushed open the creaky gate and walked up the uneven stone path. The heavy oak door resisted as he knocked, the sound echoing in the still night. For a moment, there was no response. Then, faint, shuffling footsteps approached, and the door cracked open. A gaunt face peeked out, framed by unkempt gray hair. "What do you want?" the man rasped. "Father James?" Ryan asked, keeping his tone respectful. "I'm here to ask about the temple. I think you might know something that could help me." The priest's eyes narrowed. "The temple's cursed. If you're smart, you'll leave it alone." Ryan pulled out the map and held it up. "I found this there. It looks like it leads to something important. People are disappearing, Father, and I think it's connected to the temple. Please, I just need answers. Father James's gaze flickered to the map, and for a moment his expression softened. Without a word, he opened the door wider and gestured for Ryan to come inside. The interior of the chapel was as dilapidated as its exterior. Dust blanketed the pews and cobwebs stretched across the altar. Candles burned on a makeshift shrine in the corner, their flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. Father James motioned for Ryan to sit on one of the pews. He lowered himself into another, his movements slow and deliberate. That map, he began, his voice hoarse, was drawn by someone who disappeared decades ago, a historian named William Tully. He came here to study the temple, thinking it held archaeological significance. He thought he could uncover its secrets. Instead, it swallowed him whole. Ryan leaned forward, his pulse quickening. What do you mean, swallowed him? Did something happen to him at the temple? The priest nodded solemnly. William vanished after his last trip there. All he left behind was that map and his journal, which spoke of strange symbols and rituals tied to the land. He believed the temple was built on a convergence of forces, something ancient and malevolent. Ryan unfolded the map again. Do you know what the circled area means? It seems like a specific spot beneath the temple. Father James's face darkened. That's where he believed the source of the curse lies. He called it the ascension point. He thought it was where the rituals culminated, where the veil between worlds was thinnest, but no one who's gone looking for it has ever returned. Ryan felt a chill creep up his spine but forced himself to stay focused. Do you think it's connected to the disappearances? The priest hesitated before answering. Yes, the temple's influence has always been tied to the forest and the town. It's like a wound that keeps festering. The more people poke at it, the worse it gets. Ryan clenched his fists. Then how do we stop it? There has to be a way to break whatever's causing this. Father James's gaze shifted to the shrine in the corner. There's a legend about an artifact, the obsidian key. It was said to be used by the temple's builders to seal whatever lies beneath. If it still exists, it may be the only way to put an end to this. Where can I find it? Ryan asked urgently. The priest shook his head. I don't know, but William's journal might. It should still be in his old house near the edge of town. No one's lived there since he disappeared. Be warned, though. If the temple is watching you, it won't let you go easily. Ryan stood, his resolve hardening. Thank you, Father. I'll find the journal and figure this out. As he turned to leave, the priest grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Be careful, son. The temple doesn't just take people. It changes them. Whatever you find, don't let it consume you. Ryan nodded and stepped back into the night, the map and the priest's warnings weighing heavily on his mind. The path ahead was becoming clearer, but the dangers were mounting with every step. Ginner. Ryan stood outside the chapel for a moment, the cold night air prickling his skin. Father James's words echoed in his mind. The temple doesn't just take people, it changes them. He tightened his grip on the map and made his way toward the edge of town, where William Tully's house lay in wait. The streets of Clearwater Hills were deserted, and the faint glow of streetlights barely pierced the encroaching darkness. As Ryan approached the outskirts, the houses became sparse, replaced by empty lots and overgrown fields. He spotted the house, a decrepit structure barely standing against the elements. Its windows were boarded up and the roof sagged under years of neglect. Pushing open the rusted gate, Ryan walked up the crumbling stone path. The house loomed before him, its silence oppressive. He tested the front door, which groaned but gave way with a push. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of damp wood. His flashlight revealed a dim, cluttered interior, papers scattered across the floor, shelves filled with faded books, and a desk in the corner covered in cobwebs. Ryan moved cautiously, scanning the room for anything that might resemble a journal. His footsteps echoed in the empty space, each creak of the floorboards amplifying the eerie silence. On the desk, he found a stack of notebooks, their pages yellowed with age. He flipped through them, but they were filled with mundane observations about the town. Nothing related to the temple or the map. A sound broke the silence, a faint tapping like knuckles against glass. Ryan froze, his flashlight swinging toward the boarded-up window. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Swallowing hard, he approached the window, shining his light through a crack in the boards. There was nothing there. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it had started, replaced by an eerie stillness. Ryan turned back to the desk, his heart pounding. As he reached for another notebook, he noticed something peculiar, a small trapdoor partially hidden beneath the desk. It was locked, but the wood was old and brittle. Using the heel of his boot, he managed to break it open. Inside was a wooden box, its surface carved with intricate patterns. Ryan lifted it carefully and set it on the desk. The box creaked as he opened it, revealing an old leather-bound journal and a bundle of brittle papers. Scrawled across the cover of the journal in faded ink was the name, William Tully. Ryan flipped through the journal, its pages filled with detailed sketches of the temple and the surrounding forest. Tully's writing was frantic, jumping between observations and warnings. The ascension point lies beneath the temple, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. The builders knew this and used the obsidian key to contain what they discovered. But the seal is weakening. I can feel its influence growing stronger every day. The journal described strange occurrences, voices in the woods, flickering shadows, and people disappearing without a trace. One passage caught Ryan's eye. The key is hidden where the forest whispers its secrets. Follow the path of 3 oaks and you will find the mark of the ancients. But beware, the forest guards its secrets fiercely. Before Ryan could read further, a loud crash came from upstairs. He jumped, dropping the journal. The sound reverberated through the house, sending a shiver down his spine. He stood frozen, listening for any other noise. Another crash followed, this time closer. Ryan's pulse quickened. Grabbing the journal and the map, he stuffed them into his bag and swung his flashlight toward the stairs. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear tightening in his chest. The only response was the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps descending the stairs. The beam of Ryan's flashlight landed on the staircase, but no figure emerged, only the creak of each step under invisible weight. Backing toward the door, Ryan kept his light trained on the staircase. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving the house in utter silence. Then, a whisper, a low, unintelligible murmur filled the air, seeming to come from every direction. Ryan bolted out of the house, slamming the door behind him. He didn't stop running until he was back on the main road, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Only when he was safely under the streetlights did he dare to look back. The house stood still and dark, as if nothing had happened. He pulled out the journal and the map, his hands shaking. Tully's instructions about the forest echoed in his mind. Follow the path of 3 oaks. Whatever the obsidian key was, it seemed to be the next piece of the puzzle, and possibly the only way to stop the temple's curse. Ryan glanced toward the forest looming at the edge of town. The path ahead was clear, but the dangers were mounting. He knew he couldn't turn back now. Clutching the journal, he steeled himself for the next step. Ryan spent the night poring over William Tully's journal in the safety of his motel room. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above and the occasional creak of the building were the only sounds accompanying his study. The journal's details were both fascinating and unnerving. Tully had documented everything about the temple and the surrounding forest, its architecture, its rituals, and most importantly, its connection to the obsidian key. According to his notes, the key wasn't just an artifact. It was a seal that had kept the temple's power contained for centuries. But something had disturbed the balance, and the seal was weakening. Follow the path of 3 oaks, Tully's instructions repeated in Ryan's mind. The map offered little guidance beyond a rough sketch of the forest and an X near its center. He traced the route with his finger, noting landmarks that could guide him. A split rock, a dried creek bed, and finally, the 3 oaks. At dawn, Ryan packed his bag, ensuring the journal, map, and flashlight were secure. The forest loomed in the distance as he made his way out of town, its dense canopy shrouded in mist. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick layer of clouds, casting the woods in a perpetual twilight. He reached the forest edge and paused, the air suddenly feeling heavier. With a deep breath, he stepped onto the overgrown path. The leaves underfoot muffled his movements, and the eerie silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Ryan moved cautiously, keeping his eyes peeled for the first landmark, the split rock. The forest seemed endless, its gnarled trees twisting in unnatural ways. Shadows shifted in his periphery, but every time he turned to look, nothing was there. After an hour of walking, he finally spotted it, a massive boulder cleaved in two as if struck by lightning. He approached it, the sight strangely comforting. According to the map, the dried creek bed wasn't far from here. Ryan pressed on, the forest growing darker as the canopy thickened. He checked his watch. It was mid-morning, but it felt like dusk. The oppressive silence returned, and with it, a sense of being watched. A faint sound reached his ears, a rhythmic tapping similar to what he'd heard in Tully's house. Ryan froze, gripping his flashlight tightly. The sound grew louder, echoing through the trees, but its source remained elusive. "Hello?" he called, his voice swallowed by the forest. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of his own breathing. Shaking off the unease, Ryan continued. Minutes later, he found the dried creek bed, its cracked earth littered with dead leaves. The next marker was the path of 3 oaks, where Tully claimed the key was hidden. Ryan scanned the forest, searching for the distinctive trees. As he walked, the air seemed to shift, growing colder. A strange, faint whispering began to surround him, as though the forest itself was alive with voices. Ryan couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. He spotted them at last. 3 ancient oaks standing in a perfect triangle, their roots intertwined like grasping fingers. Ryan approached cautiously, the whispers growing louder with each step. The ground beneath the trees was unnaturally bare, as though no plant dared grow there. At the center of the triangle was a stone slab, half buried in the earth. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, similar to the ones he'd seen in the temple. Ryan knelt and brushed away the dirt, revealing more of the carvings. Tully's journal described a ritual used to unlock the slab. Ryan hesitated. There was no telling what might happen if he disturbed it. But he had no choice. If the obsidian key was here, it could be the only way to stop the temple's growing influence. He followed the instructions meticulously, placing his hands on the carvings and reciting the words written in Tully's journal. The moment he finished, the air around him seemed to tremble. A low, resonant hum emanated from the slab, and the ground beneath him quaked. The stone shifted, sliding aside to reveal a hidden chamber beneath. A faint, otherworldly glow emanated from within, illuminating a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Ryan's flashlight flickered as he peered down the steps. The whispers grew louder, their urgency now laced with fear. Clenching his jaw, he descended, each step taking him deeper into the unknown. At the bottom of the stairs, the chamber opened into a small circular room. In the center stood a pedestal, and atop it rested the obsidian key. It wasn't a key in the traditional sense, but a jagged, black shard that pulsed faintly with an inner light. Ryan approached it cautiously, the air around the key charged with energy. As he reached out to take it, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. The moment his fingers closed around the key, a deafening roar filled the chamber. The walls seemed to ripple, and a dark figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. Ryan stumbled back, clutching the key as the figure loomed closer. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, its voice like the wind through dead leaves. Ryan's heart pounded as he scrambled toward the stairs, the figure closing in behind him. Clutching the obsidian key tightly, he raced up the steps, the roar of the entity echoing in his ears. As he burst into the daylight, the triangle of oaks seemed to shudder, their branches twisting violently. Ryan didn't stop running until he was well beyond the dried creek bed, his breath ragged and his mind racing. The key was his, but the forest had awakened something, and it wasn't going to let him go without a fight. Ryan didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the forest, his lungs burning and his legs trembling. The obsidian key felt hot in his hand, its faint pulse like a heartbeat against his palm. He looked back toward the dense trees, half expecting the shadowy figure to emerge and continue its pursuit. But the forest was still, as if holding its breath. He sat down on a fallen log, trying to steady his breathing. His thoughts raced. What had he just encountered? Was it a guardian of the key or something far more sinister? Either way, he knew he had no time to waste. Ryan pulled out the journal, flipping through Tully's notes for anything about what he had just seen. One passage stood out. The obsidian key is both a weapon and a curse. It binds what is below, but in unworthy hands it awakens the darkness. Those who seek it must be prepared to pay the price. The warning was clear, but it was too late to turn back now. The key was his only chance to stop whatever had been unleashed. The walk back to town was slow and cautious, every rustling leaf or snapping twig putting him on edge. By the time he reached the outskirts, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty streets. He spotted Laura's car parked outside the diner and decided to head inside. Laura was sitting at a booth, her back to the door. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "You made it back," she said. "Barely," Ryan replied, sliding into the seat across from her. He placed the key on the table, its dark surface glinting faintly in the dim light. "This is what I found." Laura stared at it, her eyes narrowing. "That's it? The thing that's supposed to stop all of this?" Ryan nodded. "It's called the obsidian key. According to Tully's journal, it was used to seal something beneath the temple. Whatever's happening now, it's because that seal is failing." Laura reached out tentatively but pulled her hand back before touching it. "It looks alive." "It feels alive," Ryan said, his voice low, "and something or someone was guarding it in the forest. I don't know what it was, but it didn't want me taking this." Laura leaned back, her gaze shifting to the window as if expecting the forest to follow them into town. "If the seal is breaking, then we're running out of time. What do we do now?" Ryan opened the journal again, turning to a section that described the temple's inner sanctum. "We need to get back to the temple. Tully believed the key could be used to restore the seal, but only in the ascension point, the place where the original ritual was performed." Laura's face paled. "The temple's dangerous. People go missing there, Ryan. And now you're telling me we have to go deeper into it?" Ryan met her gaze, his voice firm. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop this, more people will disappear, or worse." Laura hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. But we need help. Sheriff Collins might not believe us, but he knows the area. If anyone can get us into the temple safely, it's him." Ryan agreed, and the two left the diner to find the sheriff. They found him at his office, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at a cluttered desk. He looked up as they entered, his expression weary. "You again," Collins muttered, setting his cup down. "What now?" Ryan placed the key on the desk, its dark glow catching the sheriff's attention. "We found this in the forest. It's connected to the temple and the disappearances. We need your help to get inside and finish this." Collins stared at the key for a long moment, then shook his head. "You don't know what you're dealing with, kid. That place is cursed. Whatever's happening out there, it's beyond anything we can handle." Ryan leaned forward, his voice steady but insistent. "I've seen what's out there, Sheriff. I've been inside the temple, and I've faced the thing guarding this. If we don't act now, it'll only get worse." The sheriff sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You're as stubborn as your mentor. Fine. But don't expect me to pull you out if things go south." With Collins reluctantly on board, the trio gathered supplies, flashlights, rope, and a small first aid kit, and set off toward the temple under the cover of darkness. The forest seemed even more oppressive this time, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows under the pale moonlight. When they reached the temple, it was eerily silent. The heavy doors creaked as Ryan pushed them open, revealing the cold, dark interior. The faint scent of decay lingered, and their footsteps echoed ominously. The altar at the center of the room seemed to pulse faintly, as if reacting to the key in Ryan's hand. Collins shined his flashlight around, muttering under his breath. "I've been here before, but it's never felt like this." Ryan approached the altar, consulting the journal for guidance. Tully's instructions were clear: place the key on the altar and recite the ritual words etched into the stone. But as he prepared to begin, a faint whispering filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. "Do you hear that?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Ryan nodded, his heart pounding. The shadows in the room began to shift, coalescing into dark, indistinct forms. The air grew colder, and the whispering turned into guttural murmurs, as if the temple itself was coming alive. "We're not alone," Collins said, raising his flashlight to scan the room. Ryan gripped the key tightly, stepping closer to the altar. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to let them complete the ritual without a fight. The murmuring swelled, filling the temple with a dreadful resonance. Shadows writhed along the walls, their forms fluid and unnatural. Ryan's grip on the obsidian key tightened as he stood before the altar, his pulse racing. "Ryan, hurry," Laura urged, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. He flipped through the journal, finding the passage with the ritual's incantation. The words were ancient, their meaning unclear, but he had no choice but to trust them. Placing the key onto the altar's surface, he began to recite, "Anima tenebris, lux obsidiana, vinculum instaurare, per ignem et umbram claude portas aeternas." The air trembled as he spoke, the altar glowing faintly in response. The shadows recoiled slightly, but didn't retreat entirely. Instead, they seemed to focus their fury on the trio, surging forward like a tide. "Collins!" Laura shouted, pointing to a particularly large shadow that was advancing toward them. The sheriff reacted instinctively, raising his flashlight and aiming its beam directly at the form. The light disrupted the shadow, causing it to disperse momentarily, but it quickly reformed, more menacing than before. "They don't like the light," Collins yelled, sweeping his beam across the room to push back the encroaching darkness. Ryan continued the incantation, his voice growing louder with each word. The glow of the altar intensified, and the key began to vibrate as if responding to the ritual's power. The shadows retaliated, slamming into the trio with an icy force that sent Laura sprawling to the ground. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. "They're getting stronger!" Ryan's concentration wavered for a moment, his eyes darting to Laura. A cold tendril of shadow lashed out, wrapping around his ankle and pulling him to the ground. The journal flew from his hand, landing several feet away. "Ryan!" Laura screamed, rushing to his aid. She swung her flashlight at the shadow gripping him, its beam slicing through the tendril and freeing him. Collins grabbed the journal and tossed it back to Ryan. "Finish it. We'll hold them off." Ryan forced himself to his feet, clutching the journal and picking up where he left off. The words felt like fire on his tongue as he shouted them into the dark. "Anima tenebris, lux obsidiana, vinculum instaurare, per ignem et umbram claude portas aeternas." The key flared with a brilliant light, its glow spreading outward like a wave. The shadows shrieked in a high-pitched cacophony, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The temple shook violently, dust and debris falling from the ceiling as the power of the ritual reached its peak. Ryan placed his hands on the altar, pouring every ounce of willpower he had into the final words. "In nomine claritatis finem faciamus." The altar pulsed one last time, and a blinding explosion of light filled the temple. Ryan shielded his eyes, the force of the blast knocking him backward. When the light faded, the shadows were gone. The oppressive air lifted, leaving the temple eerily silent. Ryan opened his eyes to see the obsidian key lying inert on the altar, its faint glow extinguished. "Did it work?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Collins scanned the room with his flashlight, his expression wary. "I don't see anything moving." Ryan approached the altar cautiously, picking up the key. It felt cold and lifeless, like a stone. The silence was almost deafening after the chaos of the ritual. "I think we sealed it," Ryan said, though he couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. The trio exited the temple, stepping into the crisp night air. The forest was still, the oppressive weight that had clung to it now lifted. But as they walked back toward town, Ryan couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. Something about the shadow's final shriek had stayed with him, a sound not of defeat, but of retreat. "Do you think it's over?" Laura asked softly, breaking the silence. Ryan hesitated, gripping the key tightly. For now. But deep down, he knew the darkness wasn't gone. It was only waiting. The ride back to Clearwater Hills was tense. The faint glow of the ecliptic shard illuminated Ryan's lap as he stared out the window, his mind racing. The shard's energy buzzed faintly against his skin, a constant reminder of the power it held. Laura broke the silence. "Do we even know how to use it? Or are we just guessing?" Ryan flipped through Tully's journal, scanning the hastily scribbled notes. The shard amplifies the key's power. Together, they can destroy whatever's beneath the temple. But the ritual has to be performed at the ascension point. And there's one problem. "Just one?" Collins grumbled, keeping his eyes on the dark road ahead. Ryan hesitated before speaking. "The shard and the key together will destabilize the seal. For a few moments, whatever's buried will be fully unleashed before it's destroyed." Laura's eyes widened. You're saying we'll be face to face with it? Ryan nodded grimly. And it won't go down without a fight. The car fell silent again as the weight of his words settled over them. The thought of confronting an ancient, malevolent force sent a chill through Ryan, but he knew there was no turning back. When they reached the town, the streets were eerily empty, as though the residents could sense something terrible was about to happen. Collins parked outside the diner, and they regrouped around a table inside. We need a plan, Laura said, her voice steady despite the tension. We can't just walk into that temple blind. Ryan placed the shard and the key on the table, the two objects glowing faintly in unison. The ritual is in Tully's journal. I'll perform it at the ascension point, but I'll need you two to keep the shadows off me long enough to finish. And what happens if they overrun us? Collins asked, crossing his arms. Ryan's jaw tightened. We don't let that happen. If the ritual fails, there's no coming back from this. The town, the people, everything will be lost. Laura nodded resolutely. Then we don't fail. We'll hold them off no matter what. Collins sighed, his shoulders slumping. I should have retired last year. The trio prepared for the final confrontation, gathering supplies and readying themselves for the long night ahead. They armed themselves with flashlights, flares, and anything else they could find to combat the shadows. By the time they reached the temple again, the air was heavy with tension. The forest surrounding it was unnaturally still, the usual rustling of leaves and chirping of insects absent. The temple loomed ahead, its cracked stone walls glowing faintly in the moonlight. As they stepped inside, the oppressive atmosphere returned, wrapping around them like a shroud. Ryan led the way, the shard and the key clutched tightly in his hands. The inner sanctum was as they had left it, the altar standing silently at its center. The air felt charged, as though the temple itself was alive and watching. Ryan placed the shard on the altar first, its glow intensifying as it connected with the ancient stone. He followed with the key, fitting it into a small indentation carved into the altar's surface. The moment the two objects touched, the room trembled violently, and the air filled with a deafening hum. Here we go, Ryan muttered, opening the journal to the ritual's final passage. As he began to chant the incantation, the shadows returned, swirling out of the walls and coalescing into forms more solid and terrifying than before. Their glowing eyes fixed on Ryan, and they surged forward. Not today, Collins shouted, firing a flare into the mass of shadows. The burst of light sent them scattering, buying Ryan precious seconds. Laura swung her flashlight in wide arcs like her jaw clenched as she fought off the advancing darkness. The shadows recoiled from the light, but their numbers were growing. Ryan's voice grew louder as he chanted, the words flowing from him with a force that seemed beyond his control. The shard and the key pulsed with energy, their glow filling the room and pushing back the shadows. The ground shook violently, cracks spreading across the stone floor. A low, guttural roar echoed through the temple, and the altar began to glow with a blinding white light. It's waking up, Laura yelled, shielding her eyes. The light from the altar exploded outward, and for a brief moment the room fell silent. Then a figure emerged from the light, a massive, shifting form of shadow and flame, its presence overwhelming. The entity roared, its voice a cacophony of rage and pain. The shadows around it surged with newfound strength, and the room descended into chaos. Ryan clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep chanting despite the terror gripping him. The shard and the key pulsed wildly, their energy building to a crescendo. Collins and Laura fought desperately, using their lights and flares to hold off the onslaught. The entity lashed out, its tendrils of shadow sweeping through the room and smashing into the walls. Ryan! Hurry! Laura screamed, barely dodging a tendril that slammed into the ground near her. Ryan's voice reached its peak, the final words of the incantation reverberating through the temple. The shard and the key erupted in a blinding explosion of light, engulfing the entity and the shadows. The roar of the entity turned into a deafening scream, and the shadows disintegrated into nothingness. The light consumed everything, and then silence. When Ryan opened his eyes, the temple was still. The oppressive air was gone, replaced by an almost serene calm. The shard and the key lay on the altar, their glow completely extinguished. Is it over? Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan nodded, his body trembling with exhaustion. I think we did it. Collins sat heavily against the wall, his face pale. If this is what saving the world looks like, I'm not signing up again. The three of them exited the temple, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. The forest was quiet, but it was no longer filled with malice. Ryan looked back at the temple, a sense of finality washing over him. They had stopped the darkness for now, but deep down he knew this victory came with a price, and the echoes of what they had faced would linger in Clearwater Hills for a long time to come. The golden light of dawn stretched across the forest as Ryan, Laura, and Collins trudged back toward town. Exhaustion hung heavily on all of them, but the oppressive weight that had lingered for days seemed to have lifted. Clearwater Hills was still quiet as they entered its boundaries, but this time it felt more peaceful than eerie. The trio stopped at the diner, their unspoken agreement to regroup before going their separate ways. Inside, Evelyn, the waitress, stared at them with wide eyes. "You're alive," she said, her voice hushed with disbelief. "Barely," Collins muttered, sliding into a booth. "Coffee. Strong." Ryan and Laura sat across from him. Ryan placed the now inert obsidian key and a cryptic shard on the table. Their dull, lifeless appearance made them seem like ordinary objects, but Ryan knew better. "What happens now?" Laura asked, breaking the silence. Ryan stared at the key, his fingers tracing its jagged edges. "We stopped it. For now. But Tully's journal wasn't clear if the seal is permanent. If it fails again, we're not going through that again," Collins cut in. "There's got to be a way to make sure this thing stays buried forever." Ryan nodded. Tully believed the key and the shard could destroy whatever's under the temple if used correctly. But that kind of power, it comes at a cost. Laura frowned. "What kind of cost?" Ryan hesitated. "The user might not survive." Silence fell over the table. Collins cursed under his breath. "Of course it does. Why wouldn't it?" Evelyn brought their coffee, setting the cups down with trembling hands. "Whatever you three did," she said quietly, "it feels different now, like something's changed." Laura looked up at her. "Do you think the town knows that it's over?" Evelyn shook her head. "The people here, they don't talk about the temple. They pretend it doesn't exist, but maybe now they'll finally start to feel safe again." Ryan sipped his coffee, the warmth grounding him. "That's why we need to figure out what to do with these," he said, gesturing to the key and the shard. "We can't leave them where someone else might find them." "What about the government?" Laura asked. "They have facilities for stuff like this, don't they?" Collins barked a laugh. "You mean handing this over to people who'd probably try to use it for some secret weapon? Yeah, no thanks." Ryan agreed. "It's too dangerous to let anyone else have it. We need to destroy them, or hide them somewhere no one will ever find them." Laura's gaze hardened. "We already know how to destroy them. If it means making sure this never happens again, then we do it." Ryan looked down at the key and shard, their faintly glowing symbols etched into his memory. He felt the weight of the responsibility pressing on him. "If that's the plan, then we'll need to prepare. The ritual to destroy these, it'll be just as dangerous as sealing the temple." "Fantastic," Collins muttered, draining his coffee. "More danger, more shadows, more nearly dying. I love this job." Despite his sarcasm, the sheriff's resolve was clear. They all knew the stakes. "We'll need to do it soon," Ryan said, "before the energy in these things can reactivate. The longer we wait, the riskier it gets." Laura nodded. "Then we'll do it together. One last time." The three of them left the diner as the sun climbed higher in the sky. They spent the day gathering supplies, studying Tully's notes, and preparing for the final ritual. As dusk fell, they made their way back to the temple, their hearts heavy, but their determination unshaken. The shadows of the forest seemed less menacing this time, as though the land itself had been given a reprieve. Standing before the temple, Ryan held the key and the shard, their faint glow reigniting as he approached the altar. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "No turning back." Collins and Laura stood beside him, their flashlights ready. "Let's finish this," Laura said. Ryan placed the artifacts on the altar, opening Tully's journal one final time. As he began the incantation, the air around them thickened and the temple trembled. The faint whispers returned, but this time they carried an edge of anger and desperation. The key and shard began to pulse in unison, their glow intensifying as Ryan chanted. The ground beneath the altar cracked, and a dark energy rose, coalescing into a towering form. The entity roared, its voice a mixture of rage and anguish. Shadows surged from the walls, but Ryan didn't falter. "Hold them off," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Laura and Collins swung their lights, disrupting the advancing shadows. The entity lunged toward the altar, its tendrils reaching for the artifacts. Ryan raised his voice, pouring every ounce of willpower into the final words. The altar glowed brighter, and the key and shard began to disintegrate, their energy releasing in a burst of light. The entity let out a deafening scream as the light consumed it, its form collapsing into nothingness. The shadows dissolved, and the temple fell silent. When the light faded, the key and shard were gone. The altar stood cold and lifeless, its purpose fulfilled. Ryan fell to his knees, exhaustion overtaking him. Laura and Collins rushed to his side, their relief palpable. "It's done," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. The three of them left the temple as the first stars appeared in the sky. This time there was no sense of dread, only quiet triumph. Clearwater Hills would finally know peace, and the darkness that had plagued it was gone. At least Ryan hoped. For good. The air in Clearwater Hills felt different as Ryan, Laura, and Collins made their way back to town. The oppressive weight that had hung over the forest for so long was gone, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. The trio walked in silence, each lost in their thoughts. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, night had fully descended. The stars above were unusually bright, their lights spilling across the quiet streets. The once looming sense of unease had been replaced with an unfamiliar calm. Laura broke the silence first. "Do you think it's really over this time?" Ryan hesitated before answering. "The artifacts are gone and the entity was destroyed. The seal should hold now, but I can't promise it'll be forever." Collins muttered under his breath. "Great, so we might have bought the town sometime, but it's still not bulletproof." Ryan nodded. "That's why Tully's journal and everything we've learned needs to stay hidden. If anyone tries to replicate what happened here, it could all start again." They stopped outside the diner, the same place where their plan had taken shape. Inside, the faint glow of the neon sign illuminated Evelyn, who was cleaning the counter. She looked up when they entered, her expression equal parts relief and confusion. "You're back," she said softly, "and you're alive." "We did what we could," Laura replied, taking a seat at the counter. Evelyn poured them all coffee without asking, her hands trembling slightly. "The air feels lighter. People noticed it today, like a weight's been lifted." "That's the idea," Ryan said, taking a sip. Collins leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his face. "Well, here's hoping it sticks. I don't think I've got another round of that nightmare in me." Evelyn glanced at them nervously. "Are you sure it's gone? Whatever was out there?" Ryan placed a hand over the journal, which he had kept close throughout the ordeal. "It's gone. The artifacts were destroyed and the temple is sealed. But this town..." He paused, searching for the right words. "This place is tied to something ancient. If the wrong person ever stirs it again, it could resurface." Evelyn nodded, her face pale. "What do we do?" Laura spoke up, her voice steady. "You live. You move forward. Stop letting the temple and its shadows define this place. It's time for Clearwater Hills to heal." The words seemed to resonate with Evelyn, who offered a faint smile. "Maybe you're right. Maybe we can finally move on." As the trio finished their coffee, the reality of what they had accomplished began to sink in. The darkness that had plagued Clearwater Hills for decades was finally gone, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. Ryan stood, the journal in his hands. "I need to leave," he said, surprising both Laura and Collins. "Leave?" Laura asked, frowning. "I can't stay here," Ryan explained. "This journal has too much information, too many dangerous secrets. If it falls into the wrong hands, everything we've done could be undone. I need to take it somewhere safe, far away from here." Collins grunted. "You sure about that? You've been through hell for this town. Seems like you've earned a little peace." Ryan shook his head. "Peace isn't an option. Not for me. Not yet." Laura's eyes softened. "Where will you go?" "I don't know," Ryan admitted, "but I'll figure it out. Somewhere this journal can't hurt anyone." The three of them stepped outside, the cool night air a stark contrast to the heavy heat they'd felt in the temple. Ryan looked toward the dark horizon, his resolve firm. "Take care of this place," he said to Collins and Laura. "Make sure it doesn't fall back into the shadows." Laura nodded, her voice quiet. "And you take care of yourself, Ryan. You've done enough for us, for this town." Collins gave a small salute. "Don't get yourself killed out there, Carter. You're too stubborn for that." Ryan managed a faint smile. "I'll do my best." With that, he turned and walked into the night, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. Laura and Collins watched until he disappeared from view, the faint sound of his footsteps fading into silence. For Ryan, there was no celebration, no rest. The battle in Clearwater Hills was over, but his journey had only just begun. The shadows might have been defeated, but the secrets they carried would follow him wherever he went. The stars above Clearwater Hills cast a quiet brilliance over the town as Ryan disappeared into the distance. For Laura and Collins, the victory felt bittersweet. The darkness had been vanquished, but its toll lingered. The two stood outside the diner for a moment longer before Collins broke the silence. "That kid, he's carrying a hell of a burden." Laura nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "He shouldn't have to do it alone, but if anyone can keep those secrets safe, it's him." The sheriff sighed, his exhaustion evident. "We need to focus on the people here. This town's been through too much. It's time we start rebuilding." As they walked back into the diner, Evelyn approached hesitantly. "Will he come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Laura shook her head. "Maybe one day, but for now, he needs to keep moving." Collins leaned against the counter, his hands gripping the edge. "We've got work to do too. People need to feel safe again. That starts with us making sure no one stumbles into that temple, or what's left of it." Evelyn nodded, her expression firming. "I'll help. The town deserves better than what it's had." The next day, the sun rose over Clearwater Hills, bathing the town in light that felt brighter than it had in years. Word of the temple's silence spread quickly, though most of the townsfolk avoided speaking of it directly. Instead, they focused on repairing what had been broken, both in their community and within themselves. Collins organized a group to block off the forest paths leading to the temple. Signs were posted, warning against trespassing, and locals who once feared speaking out began to share their stories. The secrets of the temple were buried in whispers, but the town began to heal. Laura found herself drawn back to the observatory on Ironclad Ridge. She stood among the ruins, looking at the spot where the shard had been hidden. The air was calm, almost serene, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the land remembered what had happened there. She crouched down, running her fingers over the cracked stone. "It's over," she whispered, as if trying to convince herself. But deep down, she knew some things couldn't be erased entirely. The darkness might have been defeated, but its echoes remained. Miles away, Ryan drove along a desolate highway, the journal resting on the passenger seat beside him. The road stretched endlessly into the night, his destination uncertain. He had left Clearwater Hills behind, but the weight of its secrets clung to him like a shadow. He pulled into a gas station, the flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. As he filled the tank, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the station's window. The man staring back at him looked older, warier, as though the events in the temple had aged him overnight. Back in the car, Ryan opened the journal again. He traced the sketches and notes with his fingers, his mind racing with questions. Tully's work had saved the town, but it had also revealed something far larger than Clearwater Hills, a network of ancient sites, all tied to the same malevolent force. The journal hinted at other temples, other keys, and other seals. The thought chilled him. If what they had faced in Clearwater Hills was just one piece of a larger puzzle, then his work was far from over. He closed the journal and stared out at the empty road. The stars above seemed brighter here, far from the town's oppressive shadows. But Ryan couldn't help but wonder how long that light would last. With a deep breath, he started the engine and drove into the unknown. The journal's weight a constant reminder of the darkness still lurking in the world. For Ryan Carter, there was no final victory, only the endless fight to keep the shadows at bay. Ryan drove through the quiet night, the journal sitting heavy on the seat beside him. The hum of the car engine was the only sound, a strange comfort after the chaos he had left behind. The road stretched endlessly before him, illuminated by the cold, silver light of the moon. He didn't have a destination, just an instinct to keep moving, to stay ahead of the darkness he now carried with him. The journal had revealed more than he had anticipated. Clearwater Hills was not unique. It was part of a network of ancient sites, each guarding its own secrets, each tied to a greater malevolence. Ryan pulled into a rest stop, the air crisp and silent. He leaned against the hood of his car, gazing at the vast expanse of stars above. For a moment, the weight of the journal's secrets seemed to dissipate. But as he closed his eyes, the echoes of the temple returned. The guttural roars, the shifting shadows, the crushing weight of fear. He shook his head, forcing the memories away. Rest wasn't an option. Not yet. Back in the car, Ryan reopened the journal, flipping to a page he hadn't fully examined before. It was a rough map, one that Tully had sketched in haste. Several sites were marked, scattered across the country. Each had a name or description scrawled beside it. Hollow Peak, the Salted Caverns, Eclipse Wells. His eyes lingered on one name circled in red ink, Black Hollow Sanctuary. Tully's notes indicated it was the first site he had explored before discovering Clearwater Hills. The journal described it as a place of strange energy, where time seemed to move differently. The few who had dared venture there spoke of seeing things, visions of the past, the future, or something in between. Ryan traced the circle with his finger. If Tully had started there, perhaps that was where he needed to go next. Days passed as Ryan traveled, stopping only to sleep briefly in his car or at motels when exhaustion overtook him. Each mile brought him closer to Black Hollow Sanctuary, but it also seemed to deepen the unease that gnawed at him. He arrived at the outskirts of Black Hollow just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in shades of gray. The town was small, even more so than Clearwater Hills, with narrow streets and buildings that seemed untouched by time. The locals were wary of him, their eyes darting away when he met their gaze. It reminded him of Clearwater Hills, the same fear, the same silence. But there was something different here, an undercurrent of resignation, as if the people had already accepted their fate. Ryan stopped at a small diner, the smell of stale coffee and frying bacon hanging in the air. He sat at the counter and ordered a coffee, using the time to study the map in the journal again. "You're not from around here," the waitress said, her tone cautious but curious. Ryan looked up, offering a faint smile. "Just passing through. Heard this place has some history." The waitress frowned, glancing around to see if anyone was listening. "You mean the sanctuary?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Ryan nodded. "What can you tell me about it?" She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she poured his coffee. "Not much to tell. People don't go up there. The ones who do, well, they're never the same when they come back. If they come back." Ryan leaned forward. "What happens to them?" The waitress shook her head. "No one knows. They talk about seeing things, visions that don't make sense. Some say it's a glimpse of the afterlife. Others think it's something worse. Whatever it is, it's not meant for us." Ryan sipped his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. "Have you ever been there?" She laughed nervously. "No. And I don't plan to. If you're smart, you won't either." But Ryan wasn't here to be smart. He was here to uncover the truth. The next morning, Ryan stood at the edge of Black Hollow Sanctuary, the path before him overgrown and uninviting. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of his presence. He tightened his grip on his flashlight and stepped onto the trail. The journal's notes guided him, but the path quickly became treacherous, twisting and narrowing as it climbed. Strange carvings appeared on the trees, symbols similar to those he had seen in Clearwater Hills. Hours passed as he made his way deeper into the forest. The light grew dim, though the sun was still high. Time felt sluggish, the minutes stretching into eternity. At last, he reached a clearing. At its center stood a towering stone structure, weathered and ancient, the sanctuary. Ryan approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The air buzzed with a strange energy, and the ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if it might give way at any moment. As he stepped closer, whispers began to surround him, faint and indistinct. They grew louder with each step, their tone urgent and accusatory. "You shouldn't be here," one voice hissed. "Turn back," another pleaded. Ryan ignored them, his focus on the sanctuary's entrance. He placed a hand on the cold stone, and the whispers ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, but Ryan knew it wouldn't last. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. Black Hollow Sanctuary was alive. and it had been waiting for him. The moment Ryan stepped into Black Hollow Sanctuary, the air shifted. It was thick, charged with a strange energy that made his skin crawl. His flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the darkness. The stone walls were damp and covered in intricate carvings, symbols and patterns that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The whispers began again, louder this time, echoing all around him. They weren't just sounds, they felt like thoughts invading his mind, overlapping and chaotic. You shouldn't have come. You don't belong here. Turn back before it's too late. Ryan gritted his teeth, trying to block them out. He moved deeper into the sanctuary, his footsteps echoing on the uneven floor. The carvings on the walls grew more elaborate, their designs twisting and shifting as if alive. The journal had described the sanctuary as a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a site of convergence where time and reality blurred. Tully had written of visions, but he had never described what Ryan was experiencing, a suffocating presence that seemed to watch his every move. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. At the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, its surface cracked and glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Surrounding it were several monolithic pillars, each etched with more of the strange symbols. As Ryan approached the altar, the whispers turned into voices, distinct and purposeful. You think you can stop it? You are nothing. The cycle cannot be broken. Ryan placed the journal on the altar, flipping to the pages that described the sanctuary. According to Tully, this was where the ecliptic convergence occurred, a phenomenon that allowed brief glimpses into the past, future, or alternate possibilities. It was also where the ancient keepers of the site had hidden the truth about the network of temples. Ryan placed his hands on the altar, following the instructions written in the journal. He recited the ancient incantation, his voice steady despite the rising tension in the room. The air grew colder, and the glow from the altar intensified. The pillars around him began to hum, vibrating with an energy that shook the ground. Suddenly, the room was flooded with light, blinding and overwhelming. Ryan shut his eyes, but the light pierced through, pulling him into its embrace. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the sanctuary. He stood in a vast, barren landscape, the sky above swirling with dark clouds. The ground beneath him was cracked and lifeless, and in the distance he saw the faint outlines of the temples, dozens of them, each connected by glowing lines of energy. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in darkness but radiating a sense of immense power. Its form was undefined, shifting and fluid, its voice a blend of many. You have come far, Seeker, it said, the words reverberating in Ryan's mind, but you do not understand what you face. Ryan steadied himself, his heart pounding. Who are you? What is this place? The figure tilted its head, as if amused. I am the keeper of the veil. This is the nexus of all you seek to protect and destroy. The temples, the seals, the shadows, they are bound together, threads in a tapestry far greater than your understanding. Ryan clenched his fists. Then tell me how to stop it. How do I end this for good? The keeper's voice grew darker. You cannot. The cycle is eternal. For every seal you restore, another will fail. For every shadow you banish, another will rise. Your efforts are futile. Ryan refused to back down. There has to be a way. The artifacts, the seals, they were created for a reason. The keeper stepped closer, its form towering over him. To delay the inevitable. The forces you fight cannot be destroyed, only contained, and those who attempt to alter the cycle pay the ultimate price. Ryan felt the weight of the keeper's words, but he refused to accept them. If there's even a chance to stop this, I'll take it, no matter the cost. The keeper's voice softened, almost pitying. You are brave, Seeker, but bravery will not save you. The truth you seek lies beyond the sanctuary. If you survive its trials, you may find what you need. But beware, knowledge is a burden few can bear. The light around Ryan intensified again, and he felt himself being pulled away from the barren landscape. He awoke on the floor of the sanctuary, gasping for breath. The altar's glow had faded, and the room was silent. The journal lay open beside him, its pages blank where the instructions had once been written. Ryan sat up, his body trembling. He didn't fully understand what he had seen, but he knew one thing for certain. The battle he had faced in Clearwater Hills was only the beginning. The keeper's words echoed in his mind. The cycle cannot be broken. But Ryan refused to believe it. Somewhere, there had to be a way to end the darkness. He just had to find it. Gathering his strength, he picked up the journal and made his way back toward the entrance of the sanctuary. The answers he sought were still out there, waiting in the shadows, and he would stop at nothing to uncover them. Ryan sat on the rocky ground outside the salted caverns, the glow of the crystal in his hand fading to a soft, steady light. His chest heaved as he caught his breath, his body trembling from the ordeal. The shadows had receded, and the cavern was silent once more. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of the darkness seemed to lift. He stared at the crystal, its surface smooth and cold. Whatever ancient energy it held had stabilized, and with it, so had the chaotic echoes he'd experienced within the caverns. This was the last piece of the puzzle. He could feel it. The journal, the key, the shard, and now this artifact. They had all pointed toward a singular purpose, breaking the cycle. Ryan stood slowly, his legs unsteady but his resolve firm. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and gold. This, he thought, was where it had to end. Not in endless pursuit, but in taking action. Later that day, Ryan returned to Clearwater Hills. The sight of the small town brought an ache to his chest, a mixture of nostalgia and the weight of what he had left behind. He parked at the edge of the forest, the path to the temple still fresh in his memory. The journey to the temple felt different this time. The oppressive air was gone, replaced by a strange stillness. The trees no longer loomed like sentinels, and the whispers that once haunted the path were silent. When he reached the temple, the sight of its ancient structure filled him with both dread and determination. It was here that the darkness had first revealed itself to him, and it was here that he would end it. Ryan stepped inside, his flashlight casting a soft glow on the familiar carvings and worn stone walls. He approached the altar, where the ritual had once sealed the shadows, and placed the journal, the crystal, and the other artifacts before him. Tully's final notes, which had revealed themselves in the sanctuary, detailed a way to destroy the network of seals. The ritual would collapse the links between the temples, severing the cycle of containment and ensuring the darkness could never rise again. But it came at a cost, one that Ryan had been prepared to pay since the moment he picked up the journal. He began to chant the incantation, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The artifacts on the altar began to glow, their light intertwining as the energy within them grew. The ground trembled and the air became thick with power. The shadows returned, coalescing at the edges of the temple. But this time, Ryan wasn't afraid. He raised his voice, pouring his will into the ritual. The light from the artifacts grew blinding, forcing the shadows to retreat. A deafening roar filled the temple, the sound of the cycle resisting its own destruction. Ryan felt the strain on his body, the energy coursing through him almost too much to bear. But he didn't stop. With one final word, the light erupted from the altar, engulfing the temple in a radiant wave. The shadows screamed as they dissolved into nothingness, and the trembling ground fell still. When the light faded, the temple was quiet. The artifacts lay shattered on the altar, their power spent. The carvings on the walls no longer glowed, their purpose fulfilled. Ryan sat back, his body weak but alive. He could feel it. The cycle was broken. The temples were no longer connected, and the darkness that had once seeped through the cracks was gone for good. He stepped out of the temple into the fresh morning air. The forest was alive with the sound of bird song, the oppressive silence replaced by the gentle hum of life. For the first time, Ryan felt a sense of peace. He turned toward Clearwater Hills, knowing the town was finally free of its shadowed past. As he walked, he allowed himself a small, tired smile. The battle was over. Ryan Carter had done what he set out to do. He had ended the darkness, not just for Clearwater Hills, but for all the places the cycle had touched. The cost had been great, but the freedom it brought was immeasurable. This was the end of the journey, and for the first time in a long time, Ryan allowed himself to hope for the world, for the future, and for himself.